So we'll continue with the topic of how to stay on the spiritual path. So we discussed the topic of the contemplative practices by which we deepen our connection with the divine reality or the self. And this is the essence of the spiritual path. And then we discussed the topic of spiritual resolves, daily routine, and spiritual diary as the foundation of how to establish the systematic progress of the sadhana, because sadhana needs to be systematic. And then very important aspects of the spiritual path is what is called abhyasa and vairagya, which means practice and non-attachment, which means that we need to keep our mind in the right direction. That's the meaning. So, so the idea is that the mind needs to be kept in the right direction, which will focus it on the spiritual progress and keep it away from the distractions. This is the idea. So this is called abhyasa and vairagya. This is the foundation of spiritual progress. So this teaching appears in the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali Maharishi. It also appears in the Bhagavad Gita, in the chapter on meditation. So we will read a little bit about that. So first of all, we see in the first chapter of the Patanjali Yoga Sutras, Sutta number 5, Patanjali Maharishi says that there are 5 categories of vrittis, and some of them are painful, and some of them are not painful. They are called klishta, aklishta. See, the painful vrittis are those that will not allow a person to follow a spiritual path. That's basically the meaning. They will push the person away from the path, or even to begin with, not allow a person to think about following a spiritual path. But even when a person does follow a spiritual path, those klishta vrittis, vrittis that arise from kleshas, from wrong perceptions, ignorance, egoism, attractions and aversions and fear of death, all the perceptions that arise from this fundamental wrong knowledge will push the person away from the path. This is the idea. They will not allow the person to keep the mind on the path. So these are called klishta vrittis. They are basically what is called in the yogic tradition, they are called the inner enemies. Okay, so those forces in the mind which will very forcefully divert a person away. In the Bhagavad Gita, Lord Krishna gives the analogy of a wind and a boat in the ocean. Says those forces of klishta vrittis are like very powerful winds that will push the boat away from its path. So, and therefore, these vrittis need to be restrained. We need to learn how to restrain them, because as long as we allow them free operation in the mind, they will act as obstacles on our path. Okay? So this is the meaning. And then how do we restrain those afflicting, diverting, distracting worldly vrittis. Vrittis which basically make they do two things. Samsara constitutes of two layers, right? It's basically, you see, what is the world? The world is names and forms. These are names and forms. But then the experience of samsara is basically two fundamental layers. The first layer is that all the objects or names and forms appear to be independently real. That's called ignorance. Okay, so if we look at the world, and the first name and form that we experience is ourselves. So Swami Brahmananda is the first name and form which I perceive. But it's a name and form, it's an object. It's not really a subject. And then I perceive all the other names and forms as if they are external to the Swami Brahmananda. It's as if, because it's not true. I perceive Swami Brahmananda and all the others. Okay? So therefore, this Swami Brahmananda is called the apparent subject. Or Ramana Maharshi calls it the thief dressed as a policeman. It's as if it's a policeman. Actually, it's a thief. It's as if it's a knower or a subject. Actually, it's known. It's not a knower at all. It's not the self. It's like the light of the moon, right? What is the light of the moon? There is no light of the moon. It's the sun's light. It's the same thing. There is no light of the mind. That's the meaning. In any case, we perceive all the names and forms as real. That's the first layer of samsara, called ignorance, avidya. The second layer is that all the objects appear as desirable and undesirable. Okay? So if we look at the world, all the objects appear as independently real, and then all the objects have a quality of being desirable and undesirable, which reaffirms their real nature. Okay, for example, what's more real? Steamed broccoli or pizza? Right? It's very simple. Pizza is extremely real, and steamed broccoli is, not so real. Okay? So, because the pizza has a very powerful, desirable nature. Okay? The same thing with objects which are undesirable, things which make you fearful, upset, angry. They will be very real for you. Okay? So, raga and dvesha. This level of samsara, so the first level of samsara is called avidya. All objects appear independently real, including this object. That's the foremost object. Then the second layer, where all objects appear desirable or undesirable, is called moha, delusion. The objects have a fascinating aspect in them. They capture the mind, and the mind goes to the objects. When the mind goes to the objects become more and more and more real. The more you think about the object, the more you infuse a sense of reality in it. Okay? So that's called moha, or delusion. Okay? So these two layers make what we call samsara. Then we think that the objects are real from their own side, but Swami Sivananda says it is raga and dvesha which make the world appear real. Okay? This is the idea. So now, how do we restrain the klishta vrittis which make this world appear very real and have a desirable, undesirable, or fascinating aspect for the mind? The mind is lost in the world. That's the meaning. How do we restrain those forces? And you see, the point is, we also need to understand that anything that captures our mind will drag our mind away from the Atman. So it doesn't need to be a chocolate cake. Right? We have the famous example of Jada Bharata in the Mahabharata. Right? So he lost all his sadhana because of a deer, because of a fawn, a baby fawn. See? So Maya entered his mind through his compassion and dragged his mind away because of a fawn. It's a very innocent creature. And all his practice was lost. So it doesn't matter what it is. The moment our mind is given to something and the mind is dragged into the world, we are done. That's it. See? So, and this we need to understand. So, then, how do we restrain those vrittis? Abhyasa and vairagya. Okay, so let's see what it is. So in the second sutra, Patanjali says, there of chitta vrittis, the vrittis of the mind, the control of the chitta vrittis is brought about by practice and non-attachment. They need to be controlled because otherwise, like the powerful wind, the boat of the sadhana will be blown away into the ocean of samsara. This is the idea. So if we don't control the vrittis, if we allow the mind to go towards the objects all the time, we will not be able to sustain what we call a spiritual practice, which simply means revealing the true nature of the self more and more and more and more. That's the meaning. For this, we need to internalize our mind. Okay, so now, Swami Vishnudevananda explains what is this abhyasa, or practice, and vairagya, or non-attachment. The different forms of mental modifications which bring about pain can be controlled in two ways. The first is abhyasa, which is practice or repetition. So, first of all, you see, this type of vrittis, this type of the thinking that makes the world appear real and fascinating is called samsara, and it brings pain. How does it bring pain? So, in the Bhagavad Gita, Adi Shankaracharya says there are two main forces in samsara. They are called moha, which we mentioned. Moha means fascination. The mind becomes fascinated with objects. Okay? And so this is the point. Then the second one is called shoka, or grief, which means the moment the mind is fascinated with the objects, grief is a matter of time. Okay? So because all the objects are impermanent, they will go away, they will cause grief. This is the idea. So these are the two formidable forces of samsara: fascination and grief. This is the idea. So how do we control them? In two ways. The first is abhyasa, which is practice or repetition. A change of character occurs only through formation of new habits. So the mind is very powerfully habituated into the samsaric ways, into becoming, you see, the mind is habituated into seeing the objects of the world as real and being fascinated with those objects. It's a very powerful, deep habit, or what we call vasanas, and therefore it will change only very gradually. We need to repeat again and again and again and again for years together to gradually bring a change of mind. So to change the mind from a worldly mind, a samsaric mind, that flows to the world, seeing the world as real and fascinating, to a yogic mind that learns to perceive the divinity or the self in the world, takes many, many, many years of great effort. Okay, so this is what it means. Abhyasa is needed. But this abhyasa is very important, and it's important that the aspirant puts the effort. Why? If we don't put the effort, we will always scratch the surface. If we always scratch the surface, we will never get to a level of deep inspiration. Sadhana will always remain something superficial for us, and it will be difficult for us to stay on the path. So we need to put a deep effort to reach strong results so that our foothold in the path will become stronger. We will have convictions because of personal experience. So the idea is that we need to reach a level of sadhana in which we are inspired. You see, in the initial stages, there will be lots of frustrations because we don't yet experience the depth of the practice. On the other end, we experience lots of emotional noise in the mind. The mind is chaotic, the mind is very emotional, it has lots of resistance, and, you know, it just wants to run away to the coffee and croissant. And it becomes very irritated. You see, why should I do this meditation where I can just, you know, devote myself to coffee and croissant? You see? So we need to get over these stages of sadhana. And the only way we are going to get over it is if we put deep effort, concentrated effort to reach the levels of inspiration. You see, we have to overcome these levels of sadhana. So this is very important. Otherwise, we will always be on the surface and it will be difficult for us to progress. So, so then, practice must be constant. So we need to be regular in our practice, because if we are not, the opposing forces, which simply means the karmic force, the forces that which have been cultivated throughout, the yogis say, billions of lifetimes, so they are very powerful. If we relax our efforts, those forces immediately gain the upper hand. This is the idea. Therefore, it needs to be constant, and so it says, if there are interruptions in the practice of stilling the mind, or if the effort is not continued over many, many years, the results will only be temporary, and all progress will fade. Practice must be constant. It must also be done with an attitude of earnestness. So we need to be earnest in our desire to progress spiritually. Only when there is true desire to reach the goal is success assured. Okay, so this is called abhyasa. Then he says, what is vairagya? The second way is through vairagya, or non-attachment, or elimination. So look how beautiful Swami Vishnudevananda is defining vairagya. Elimination of emotional reactions to situations and individuals. So he says, what is vairagya? Vairagya is elimination of emotional reactions to situations and individuals. Basically, vairagya is the elimination of raga and dvesha. That's basically what it is. Which means the pairs of opposites, pleasure and pain, success and failure, victory and defeat, gain and loss, etc., are impacting the mind. They are troubling the mind. They are throwing the mind off. we need to learn to have equanimity in the face of people, situations, etc. This is called vairagya, elimination of emotional reactions. This is how Swami Vishnu defines it. Non-attachment does not mean there should not be love or compassion, but rather that emotional thought waves are ignored. The vrittis may arise, but they are observed in disinterested fashion, then put aside. So actually, non-attachment is pure love. Actually, love and non-attachment are the same thing. It's the same thing, it's a different term for the exact same thing. So actually, compassion and love are non-attachment. It's a synonym. And attachment is not love. Attachment is actually the constrictor of love. It makes love limited to raga and dvesha, which means if the situation is pleasant, I am able to love. If the situation becomes unpleasant, I am unable to love. So love becomes constricted by raga and dvesha when attachment is playing in our mind. Non-attachment means that the love is unconditional, which means whether it's pleasant or unpleasant, love overcomes it. That's the meaning. Love overcomes the limitations of raga and dvesha. This is what we see in saints. Saints will be able to be loving and compassionate no matter what. In difficult situations, in pleasant situations, and so on. Okay, so this is the meaning of non-attachment. The emotional reactions are observed disinterestedly and put aside. Why? Because there is discrimination. There is the power of discrimination. Okay, then we have to continue. I just want to, 1 minute also, speak about something which is called titiksha. Titiksha means endurance, to be able to endure. Because when we say remaining on the path, what we mean is enduring. Right? Like Lord Jesus said, whoever wants to follow me should carry their cross. The cross means the suffering. So there is suffering involved. There is suffering involved also in worldly life. More suffering. But Swami Vishnudevananda says this is suffering that leads to more suffering. In the spiritual path, it's suffering that leads to liberation. We need to endure it. So endurance is called titiksha. And Swami Sivananda writes about it. He says that titiksha is a state of enduring or bearing, right? Like bear insult, bear injury. It is the capacity or power to endure without opposition from within, and to suffer pain, distress, hardship, or any very prolonged stress without succumbing, murmuring, complaining, lamenting, or repining. Okay, so to be able to endure suffering that comes from one's own mind, powerful negative emotions, powerful desires, attachments, grief, all those things will definitely come. And opposing situations from outside, obstacles and so on, to be able to endure and overcome them. Without this quality, one cannot remain on the path. It is patient fortitude. It is the ability to bear and continue in spite of destructive forces. He who endures conquers. Through endurance, willpower and patience are developed. Through endurance, evils and difficulties are overcome. Your strength often increases in proportion to the obstacles imposed upon you. The greater the difficulty, the more glory in surmounting it. Through endurance you exhibit your divine grandeur and make alliance with God. Titiksha, or endurance, is a condition of wisdom. It is a means for acquiring knowledge. Okay, so this is a little bit about the capacity to stay on the